Okay, so part two of the M3 Lee review and build, and the first thing I'm going to do here is do some tidy up of the model a bit before painting. So what you see me doing here is I'm using a hobby knife just to clean up some of the sprue gates from the building process. Not really a whole lot to clean up on this model. It's built pretty well. Just be careful, you know, the hobby knife is of course very sharp, and also you don't want to take more away from the model than that you should. So really, you know, after I use a knife, take some sanding sticks and just smooth everything out. You know, smoothing out those sprue gates that I just cleaned up with the knife, and then just anywhere that I see either seam lines or too much buildup of you know, the paint that they put on the model as it came out of the blister. And I know in part one I said that, you know, the primer was kind of rough, but not necessarily a bad thing. It's yeah, it's rough, but it's also very tough. You know, which is a good thing since we're going to be playing games with this model. So doing the same thing here to the turret. Um, yeah, I wasn't able to get it on the camera here. My bad, but you get the idea. The same idea, just you use the knife where I need to, and then smooth things out with the sanding sticks. And that was pretty much it. And then, you know what I like to do next is using a Tamiya sanding sponge. Is like a 400 grit sanding sponge and just a sanding stick. I just like to go all over the model and really smooth out that primer. What I find is, you know, when you do the detail painting later on in the model, that, you know, the whole thing is just a little smoother. And like I said before, like this primer is rough but also very tough, which is good. You see me here using not only, you know, the sanding sponge, but also a little sanding stick to get in the, you know, those nook and crannies. I like to cut that sanding sponge kind of at an angle, so you know, in the little corners you can really get in there. And I run my finger through it just to make sure, you know, things are smooth. So they're getting there. And then really the last step I do here is you know, I use some water and do some wet sanding. So same idea, using the sponge, using the stick, you know, keeping my sponge you know, nice and wet here, and really just keep sanding all the primer. Get a nice smooth finish. And in areas that are kind of hard to reach, that's where that sanding stick comes in handy. And I just like to go around all the little areas, you know, up here on top of the hole, and do the same thing in the turret. The turret is pretty easy because it's nice and flat, nice rounded shapes, so super easy. Be careful when you sand the barrel of the gun, that's pretty fragile. You know, don't use too much force. And then what I found is when I put the turret back in the model, and there was something sticking. I could feel that paint kind of being really rough up there, so yep, just continue sanding it, make it nice and smooth, and just to make sure that once I do the detail painting, everything is nice. There okay, so the next step I did here before going into painting, and I did this off camera because it was just easier to do it without the camera on the way, is I filled in some of the gaps. You see the white over here is using some you know, acrylic putty stuff you clean up with actually water with like a moist Q-tip. filled up some of the gaps up here in the hole, and then there was some gaps right here in the back as well. And then the one gap I couldn't hide was there's a pretty substantial gap back here. So what I did is I used a tarp out of the spares box and just glued that up there to kind of hide that gap. Yeah, I think you can see it a little bit, but the tarp is going to be kind of in the way, and I think it's going to hide that pretty well. And then really the last thing before going into painting is I like to mount my model on a handle so I can paint the model without touching the paint job. And it's a very basic thing here. It's some Legos with some poster putty, the blue tack stuff. It's makes it a nice handle. And then for the turret, it's just a little peg. Same idea. That way I don't have to touch it as I'm painting. So anyway, now it's up to some choices, right? We've got to figure out whether this is going to be a Soviet M3 Lee or an American M3 Lee and in North Africa type thing. Either way, I got to go ahead and put a coat of primer on this. So I'm going to use this stuff right here. It's the Krylon Camouflage, and it's pretty much, you see the color there, it's like an olive drab camouflage. I'm going to use this as a primer. It sprays really well, and also pretty tough and smooth. So I'm going to bring this model outside, put some primer on it, just to cover down that putty job that I did. And then we'll start doing some painting. In our reality, the way, whether it's a Soviet M3 Lee or an American M3 Lee, it's going to be olive drab. So olive drab is the first color we got to work on. So let's get that going. Okay, so I got the model sprayed with some olive drab, and now I'm going to start doing some painting. So the first thing I'm going to do here is get some paint, and this is the Vallejo line of paints, Vallejo olive drab. And I'm going to do what's called a wet dry brush or heavy dry brush of the entire model. So what I do is I use a big rounded makeup brush, load up the brush, remove the excess on the paper towel, but not all the excess. I leave quite a bit of paint on the brush, and then really just go all over the model with it. Pretty much lay it pretty wet on the model. And really what I'm trying to do is cover the whole model with the paint. Try and keep it nice and smooth. And the wet dry brushing with this type of brush does that. It actually makes it pretty smooth. Trying to keep the model here on frame. But that's pretty much it for this step. You get kind of the idea. What I'm going to do is apply a wash all over the model, and what I'm using here is Citadel's Athonian Camo Shade on a nice rounded brush to really load up the shade in there. And really all I do is just go all over the model. Once again, let the wash pool in all the recesses. Get all the little details on the model to stand out. And really the only thing you need to be careful is as you apply the wash is don't let it pull too heavily on flat surfaces, because it just looks it looks kind of weird, even though we can take care of that later when we the next step, which is we go back to our olive drab paint and we do some dry brushing again. Okay, so the next step after the wash is completely dry, we go back to dry brushing. And this time is just to have all the highlights pop up. So the first dry brush here you see me doing, this time with a smaller makeup brush, and I'm removing a lot of the paint. But it's basically going back to that olive drab, the Vallejo olive drab. And then after that I do a Vallejo olive drab and Vallejo khaki, like 50-50 mix. Same idea here is, picking up the smaller details on the model is basically, some edge highlighting. This model has a lot of, bolt detail all over it, so it's just picking up those higher, details, just make them pop out a little more. As you can see, I remove a lot of the paint of the paintbrush before I go over it. And then the last highlight is just pure Vallejo khaki or khaki. Same idea, remove most of the paint off of the paintbrush, and then I'll go all over the model with this, just picking up, the high details, those little boats, the edges of the model, to make everything just stand out a little better. Okay, so after all that dry brushing, here's the final product. I think you can see this on camera. I've got a pretty even olive drab coat all over the model, looking pretty smooth. Some very subtle, shadowing with the wash that I did, and then just all the highlighting with the subsequent, olive drab, the mixed 50-50 mix, olive drab, khaki, and then finally the khaki.